for the Institute for Holocaust Education. This is my boss, Scott Litke. Together, we try to bring Holocaust education to students, and this is our annual Week of Understanding. IHE has been doing this for 11 years, and the speaker that you will hear today, Agnes, has been doing this for 9 out of the 11 years. She's born in Hungary, but it will be coming to us today from Skokie, Illinois. Usually she comes here to Omaha, and so it is disappointing that we can't do this in person, but last year we had to cancel everything right before this week due to COVID, so we're just glad that we can bring it to you virtually. Yesterday, Agnes was an hour early for our talk, and today she's making me sweat a little bit. So I may have to hop off and hop on the phone again and just make sure that she knows 9:50 is in 1 minute. Gretna, I know you only have an hour. So I'm going to do that right now, and I'll be back to you in 1 second. She is just getting to the computer. So we will see her in 1 minute. So Gretna, I know you have exactly an hour and need to hop off at 10:50. We are recording this, and so if we don't get to the question and answer session by the time you have to hop off, I will get the recording to you so you can see that maybe in your classrooms tomorrow. And I would encourage Wahoo and North Bend and Humboldt to stay on and ask some questions. The stories of our survivors are long and detailed, and it usually takes about an hour to get through the experience of their life. Agnes was born in 1933, so you guys can do the mental math while we wait for her to get on the call. We are so grateful that she is able and willing to use Zoom. She's been talking to schools all over the country and even in Canada this year.
Good morning.
Good morning. We've been talking about you. Have your ears been burning?
Oh, of course.
Of course. We have 4 different schools here this morning, Agnes. We have Gretna, we've got Wahoo, we've got North Bend, and we've got Humboldt. Now, Gretna has...
I remember Wahoo. I have talked at Wahoo before.
Yes, and then you might have even been to Gretna in the last 9 years.
That's very possible, but Wahoo stands out in my mind. But
Well,
these are new students, because 9 years ago, well, these kids must be all grown up.
I know, and they have to hop off this call at 10:50, and we're going to keep going with the other 3 schools for question and answer, but I have already introduced you, and I'm just going to let you go.
All right, thank you, Kaya.
Thank
you. I have altogether how much time?
So you have, the other schools have plotted 90 minutes. Gretna has to leave in an hour, but the rest of us will still be here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Omaha. I'm so sorry that I cannot be there in person, but the COVID won't let me. But I'm happy to be with you anyhow, and I'm happy to be with several different schools. And first of all, let me thank the Illinois Week of Learning, the people at your federation for making this possible. And I also want to thank your teachers for teaching the Holocaust, because to me, as a Holocaust survivor, that is very, very important. So, since my time is limited, let's start at the beginning. I was born in 1933 to parents who had been married 8 years, and supposedly they wanted a child very much. And I finally came into the world, and the story at that time when I was young went that the doctor and my dad wanted a little girl so badly he gave the doctor an extra $100. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea, but it certainly made a little girl feel good. My family consisted of my parents, my mother's side grandparents who lived in a small town called Rákosliget, about an hour's train ride from Budapest. And I love to spend time with grandma and grandpa. They ran like almost like a mini farm. They raised chickens and ducks and geese, and grandma grew vegetables and beautiful flowers, and the aroma from the fruit trees was absolutely overwhelming. Many, many summer vacations, I spent a lot of time with grandma and grandpa. And then my mother had an older sister, Elsa, and Elsa was a wonderful seamstress, and she made all my clothes. And she was married but childless, so I was her baby too. In other words, I was the only child that this family had in Europe, and they spoiled me rotten, and I was surrounded by a lot of love. My parents operated a business whereby they sold yard goods and the accessories that went with it to tailors. And so because my mom was a full-time businesswoman, we had a live-in housekeeper, Julia. Julia cooked delicious meals, cleaned the house, played with me, took me to the park. We bonded very quickly. Well, I don't even remember a time without Julia. So she must have come to work for us when I was very young. And she just became, as I said, a part of the family. I was lucky enough to have been born into a relatively affluent home. We spent a lot of summers, or a part of a summer at least, on beautiful Lake Balaton with my parents and their friends and their kids. And I always loved the water. I learned to swim very young, and I love to do any kind of water sports. And then in the wintertime, we vacationed in the beautiful ski chalets of the Kékes Mountains. I never learned to ski because my parents always felt that was too dangerous. And then the rest of the summer I spent with grandma and grandpa. So my life was very good, and I am telling you all this so you can compare it with what happened later on. I started to hear from my mother even before I started school that it was very, very important to be a good student and get good grades, because already at that time there was a law called numerus clausus, whereby only 1% of a college class could be made up of Jews. If you weren't at the top of your class, there was no opportunity to go to a university. My mom had 2 more sisters. They were altogether 4 freedmen girls. And her other 2 sisters had immigrated to the United States long before I was born. And they kept urging my parents to immigrate also. And my father's mantra was, well, Jews have never had it so good in Budapest. I have a outgoing business. The rest of the family is here, and we don't want to go anywhere. I knew nothing about a war. My parents tried so hard to keep reality away from me so as not to scare the child. I knew that we were at war with somebody, but I had no idea who was fighting who. So now I get enrolled in school, and my parents send me to a Catholic little girls' school. And I have nobody to ask today why, but I can imagine that I can come up with two reasons. And one was that it was probably the best education in the area. And two, they might have felt safer sending a Jewish little girl to a Catholic school. I was not the only Jewish child there. There were several other Jewish little girls. I felt absolutely no anti-Semitism in school. We were all treated equally. Every morning, because it was a Catholic school, we studied the New Testament. And I'm trying to get to see you all. Okay. It's better. And there was a teacher who came in to teach us our own religion a couple times a week. After school, it was a different story. The Catholic kids had their Catholic friends and the Jewish kids had their Jewish friends, and we never ever mingled any kind of activity after school. And one day I went home from school and I said to my parents, you know, there's a funny looking flag on one of these buildings that I passed. And they explained to me that that was the headquarters of the Hungarian Nazi Party. And of course, the flag had a swastika on it. And that was truly my first acquaintance with the swastika. What it stood for, I still it was not clear to me at all. So the school system in Budapest was such that you went to school for 4 years and then you graduated. And then it depended on your grades, whether you could go on to a gymnasium, which was an 8-year college preparatory school, or if your grades weren't good enough, then you went on to another 4 years of trade school. So when you got out of school, you could make a living. And tears of joy ran down my mother's face as we went to the school after graduation. And there was a list posted on the door. And I did make it into the gymnasium, and that was her aim all along. So everybody was very happy. To me, probably didn't mean nearly as much as age 10 as it meant to my mother. So I went on to the Jewish gymnasium with several of my little Jewish friends. And by this time, the Allies were bombing, and virtually always in the dark of night, and the air raid siren would go off, and we'd head for the basement. I lived in a 3-story apartment building on the 3rd floor. Everybody trembled and was scared. I really, at age 10, could not fathom the idea that a bomb was going to hit us, and it didn't at that time. And then the all clear signal came on, and we all went upstairs and back to bed. And this became such a routine that in the morning, we automatically got up. I got dressed for school, and my parents got dressed for work, and off we went. And just another day. And life went on like this, relatively calm, because most of the European Jews were already in concentration camps, and which certainly we did not know at that time, until March 1944, when the Nazis were certainly for sure losing the war already. But as a last-ditch effort, Hitler sent Adolf Eichmann. I'm sure you've all heard of the notorious Adolf Eichmann, who was put in charge of the final solution that was ridding Europe of Jews. and he was supposed to finish the job in Hungary. Well, the Germans walked across the border. They didn't have to fight their way across the border because Germany and Hungary were allies. And many, many people very much welcomed the Germans, except this was the time that the Jews really got scared of what's going to happen to us now. The first thing that happened was that I had to, and we all had to wear a yellow star. And I remember watching my mother sew them, and they had to be 10 centimeters in diameter and sewn on sufficiently that you couldn't pass a pencil between the stitches. Should the occasion arise that you want to tear it off. At that time, I did not know, but within a matter of 45 days, Adolf Eichmann was able to deport all the Jews of Hungary except the Budapest Jews after they occupied the country. But my parents must have known something about the deportations because they moved Grandma and Grandpa in with us because they felt that nothing like that could happen in the big city. I had to stop going to school. My dad lost his business. And now, of course, we were a little bit more crowded, but it was still okay. But to go outside, well, fear was etched on everybody's face. And many times our Jew went out to the grocery store and never returned home. And to this day, people are wondering what happened to some of their loved ones. In June, a new anti-Semitic law came down, which stated that all Jews had to move into what they called the Yellow Star building or a Jewish designated building, both meaning the same. There was a big yellow star painted on the front door, and that designated that only Jews were in that building. We could only take what we could carry. And now we were assigned an apartment there, which had 2 bedrooms, and there was an elderly lady and her daughter living in the other bedroom, and then was the Grandma, Grandpa, Mom, and Dad, and I in the other bedroom. Well, we were crowded, but we were together. I'm sorry. And well, to me as a child, the worst part of that apartment, well, I went to sleep for the first time and I woke up with this big red welts all over me and they were itching something awful. And I was scratching and I said, what is this? And the place was infested with bed bugs. And you cannot get rid of bed bugs when they're infesting the whole building. So this scenario took place every time I went to sleep and I woke up. And by law, the bathtubs had to be filled with water just in case there's a bombing. And these 2 ladies would go during the night and shake their nighties into the bathtub. And I'd get up in the morning and go to the washroom and there would be a floating blanket of bed bugs. And it really was not a very appetizing sight. Now, my mom was always a businesswoman. She was never a cook, but Grandma was there and she could make with what she could find. One of the problems was many people had been out of work for a while, so they didn't have any money to buy groceries. And even those who had a few dollars, Jews were only allowed to shop after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And by that time, the grocery shelves were pretty empty. But Grandma made do with whatever she could find. And I cannot tell you that I ever went hungry then, because perhaps the adults gave me some of their portion of food also. I have no idea. I was also very lucky because most children were torn away from their parents. And I can't even imagine how terribly frightened they must have been before they were sent to their death, because Nazis had no use for Jewish children growing up and being in the world. They were trying to get rid of the adults. I was also lucky because I was always with somebody I knew would take care of me and love me. Now, after a bit, and my grandfather was already not well when we moved in there, but after a bit, he got so sick that we had to move him into a hospital. And imagine an old wartime movie with beds lined up one next to the other, or perhaps MASH. And the whole family went to take Grandpa to the hospital. And of course, then we had to leave. And I remember him lying on this metal bed. And none of us ever found out what became of him, whether he died of natural causes, they starved him to death, or whether they killed him. But I still had my mom and dad and my grandma. And then one day, a group of Nazis marched into the building, and a gunshot rang out into the air. And everybody, of course, jumps to attention. And they have a megaphone, and they order all men, working age men, 18 through 45, let's say, to line up downstairs. And this included my daddy. And, well, my parents had beautiful clothes because the tailors, their customers, made all their clothes. So everything was custom made, and they had beautiful coats and suits. So my dad put on his beautiful custom-made winter coat, and this is November. And the Hungarian winters are bitter cold and snowy, just like the Midwestern winters here. And everybody had to have a little knapsack prepared to move anytime. So he put on his knapsack and his galoshes. And you know, the Nazis told an awful lot of lies. But the one in this case was that they told people in my building that they're only taking these people to work and they'd be back. Of course, that was not their intention. These people were being deported. But that keep the rest of the population calm. And so my daddy kissed us goodbye, and he was gone. I still had my mom and my grandma. And a few days later, the exact same story takes place, except this time they want the ladies. Well, there stood my mother in front of me in her beautiful gray Persian lamb coat and boots and little knapsack. And well, like you would tell your children or your parents, your mom would tell you if she was leaving you like for a weekend with grandma and grandpa, be a good girl, listen to grandma, and I'll see you soon. And she tried so hard to put a smile on her face, just not to scare me. I was 11 years old, and that's the last time I ever saw my mother. I never saw her again. I still had grandma. I still wasn't alone. And then there was a knock at the door. And of course, we all jump to attention when there's a knock at the door because it must be the Nazis, and what do they want now? And to our surprise, it was my father. And he told us that he was in a transport, not knowing where they were going, of course. And a couple of Nazi officers needed directions to Budapest. And that was his lucky day because he spoke a fluent German and he became their guide. Thus, they brought him back to Budapest and let him go. As soon as he came in, he looked for my mother, and grandma and I told him the story that what had happened. And immediately he said, I'm going after her. Said, I know where they're collecting the people. They're collecting them at the brick factory. Well, as it turns out, that most of the time they collected the people at the brick factory, because the brick factories were situated on the railroad, and that facilitated deportations. And I, as a little girl, cried, "Daddy, don't leave me. Mommy's gone. Please don't leave me." And even my mother's mother said to him, "There's nothing you can do for her." And she was absolutely right. So my dad did not go. And once again, a few days go by and there's another knock at the door, and, you know, we all freeze. And we open the door and there's our housekeeper, Julia, my second mother. And Julia came to take me home with her and hide me. Now, I have no idea whether this was prearranged with my parents or at that time she took it upon herself to come and get me, or whether my father paid her for hiding me. And, you know, the pay is totally immaterial because the fact is that she risked her life in order to save mine. If anybody had found out she was harboring a Jewish child, that would have been at the end of her and the end of me. So my grandmother threw a few articles of clothing into a brown paper bag, and we took off my yellow star, and we went off on the streetcar to her house. And on the way, she told me that we're going to tell the neighbors that my family lived in Eastern Hungary, where the Russians were already occupying the country. And they wanted to send me away from the Russian occupation, so they sent me to my Aunt Julia. Of course, I took her name. I had no papers under that name, and nobody ever asked me for any. I got lucky. So now my Catholic school education came in handy. Should anybody ask me any questions about the New Testament, I knew I could have answered. But she also knew that I was not familiar with the rosary, and she thought an 11-year-old child should know the rosary. So she taught me that on the way to her home. Now, Julia lived in a big building, 5-story apartment building. And I slept in a big bed with her, and she put her arm around me, and I felt very, very safe with her. Julia, once again, I didn't starve because she had beans and potatoes and smoked meats in her pantry. And for a while, she actually baked bread. And we lived like that for a little bit until one day it just started raining bombs from the sky, night and day and day and night. And this 5-story apartment building, everybody heads for the basement. And there's a big stack of wood all piled up. And we made ourselves beds, one next to the other, with the blankets and the pillows. You can imagine how uncomfortable it was to lay on a bunch of chopped wood. Well, this basement was not created to be lived in. There was no electricity down there. There was no heat down there. We lived by candlelight. It was dark, it was damp, it was cold, it was dingy. But worst of all, it had no toilet facilities. And now you have all these people without toilet facilities. So a bucket is designated as a toilet. And when it gets dark at night, somebody opens the door and the waste is thrown out. And the place becomes very smelly in a hurry. And there wasn't much choice because either you learn to live with the smell or you went outside and the bomb hits you. So we learned to live with it. And in between bombings, Julia would run upstairs and grab some food. And she'd tell me all kinds of stories of when I was little and about my family, just to try to keep me amused. And we lived like that for a couple of months, the end of November through the middle of January. When word started traveling from building to building, that guerrilla warfare was taking place in the streets and the Russians were occupying Budapest, thereby freeing the Jews. Well, now you can imagine an 11-year-old child at Julia's home, how scared I was. I wanted to cry out and say I want to go home to mommy and daddy, and I knew I couldn't. I couldn't even laugh out loud, not that anything was funny, but I could not do anything to draw attention to myself. And even as an 11-year-old, I knew enough to behave myself. So the bombing stopped, and even the machine gun fire stopped. And finally, we had enough nerve to open the basement door. And it's middle of January, and there's snow on the ground, and the sun is reflecting off of the snow. And well, your eyes can't see a thing because you're blinded from having been in the dark, and now your pupils have to adjust to the sunlight. But as soon as the door was opened, I could smell, and that smell lingers on in my nose forever and ever. And the only way I can explain that smell was it was the smell of death. There were dead bodies all over. There were dead horses all over. But you know, the last couple of weeks in that basement, we had really totally given up on survival. The question really became what's going to kill us first, the Nazis or the bombs. But now the war was over, we were alive, and we were free. Regardless of the conditions, finally, we were free. One of Julia's staircases was bombed out. The other one, we could go up to her apartment. Everybody who was in that basement was full of lice. And I don't know, Julia had some kerosene or something. I can remember her going through my hair over and over with a fine-tooth comb. But that was such a minimal problem compared to the life and death situation we had just survived. Now, today, you all have a cell phone on you, in your pocket, in your purse, wherever, and you can communicate instantly with somebody. Well, imagine a world without cell phones and even without house phones. Many, many homes in the 1940s in Hungary did not have a house phone. And Julia was one of those houses. But even if she had had a phone, all the lines were bombed out, so it would not have been usable. So there was nothing we could do except wait and see who might turn up from the family. I never even considered the fact that my family might have died. That didn't even cross my mind. And I was playing in front of her apartment one day, and I looked up, and there was my father. My father, who was a very handsome, tall, erect walking man, now hunched over and barely dragging himself. He was skin and bones, and he looked awful. And I flew into his arms. I was so happy to see him. And he came in and he told us the story of his survival. There was a Swedish diplomat by the name of Raoul Wallenberg. And there were some others too, but I can tell you about Raoul because he's the one who saved my father's life, who was commissioned to buy up as many apartment buildings as he possibly could. And I have no idea how my dad got the proper papers, but because you had to have certain papers to live in one of those houses. I am sure they cost some money. Some were real, some were fake. But the fact is that Mr. Raoul Wallenberg saved over 10,000 Jews of Budapest. So he announced to the Nazis that these people are Swedish citizens and under his auspices, and Sweden will take them when the war was over. Sometimes that worked, and sometimes Hitler still raided those buildings, but not the one my dad was in. But he also told us that food was very scarce. Obviously, he was so skinny. And to quote him, there wasn't even enough room to stretch a leg. But the war was over. My daddy at least was alive. And it was obvious that he needed good food and rest. And passenger trains were not running. And he and I got on a freight train, much like the one they used for deportations. And we went for a ride. I was so happy to with him. I never questioned where we were going. And we got off in a small village. He knocked on a farmer's door. They negotiated. I don't think that these farmers would have taken us in unless my dad paid for it. And, you know, I also ask myself now, where did he get the money? And the only way, the only thing I can come up with that he probably gave Julia some money to hide me. Anyhow, the farmer and his wife took us in. That lady made a big bowl of scrambled eggs that night. And that was the most delicious thing I had eaten, God only knows for how long. We hadn't as much as seen an egg for at least the last couple of years. And there's good food on a farm. There's livestock and vegetables and milk, and they put us up in a room. And we stayed there for 2 or 3 weeks until my daddy got on his feet to go home. And the little town had a local soccer team. Soccer is Hungary's national sport. My dad liked the soccer games, so we would go in the afternoon and watch them play. I couldn't have cared less about the soccer, but I was at my daddy's side, and that was the most important thing. And we ate and we slept, and he got better. And eventually we went back to our original home where we started out on Lisference there. There was a family living in our home. This was a decent family because most Jews were robbed of all the belongings they had to leave behind, and we could only take what we could carry. But these people left our belongings intact. I still have a few treasures from the beautiful break front we had. And I truly treasure those things because they belong to my parents and to my grandparents. So for a brief time, we shared an apartment with them until they could find another place to live. And then my dad and I lived there. And, you know, slowly life took on some normalcy. My dad got his business back. And I went back to the Jewish gymnasium. Very interesting, ladies and gentlemen, because it would have been such an obvious question at my age now to ask my friends, how did you survive? Where are your parents? None of us dared to touch that subject. Nobody even broached it. I think we were all so traumatized by what had happened, and many of my friends were missing at least one parent. So, you know, it was a very, very difficult situation, but I was going to school once again. And now train loads of deportees keep returning from the various camps, telling all the horror stories. They're all sick and skin and bones. And with every train load, I wonder if my mommy's coming. And I was convinced that she would come because she loves me and she's coming home to me. And my mommy wasn't on any of them. And I kept waiting and waiting. And one day my dad came home from the store and told me that a lady came in. My dad told me that all the Jews who were in the Jewish designated or yellow star buildings were pushed into the Budapest ghetto, which was a much smaller area. It was extremely crowded. There was no food or very little food and absolutely no sanitation. And now, just about now, the war is truly coming to an end. But the Hungarian Nazis, the Arrow Cross, were adamant to kill as many Jews as they possibly could until their time ran out. So my grandmother and my uncle and aunt ended up in this ghetto. And the Jews were not dying fast enough for the Nazis, so they would come and march a group down to the shores of the Danube and wire 8, 10 people together. And their ammunition was also running low. So with one shot, they could sink them all to the icy Danube. And that was the fate of my darling grandmother and uncle and aunt, who were all decent, law-abiding people. They were good citizens, and they were always Hungarian before they were Jewish. And their only sin had been having been born a Jew. So now we knew what happened to that part of the family. Now, around 1942, my parents started to wake up to the realities of immigrating to America. And our immigration process started. And actually, we had all our papers, all our ducks in a row. There were these huge wicker baskets sitting in the living room filled with our belongings. And they had already shipped out. They were already in Lisbon, when in the last minute, the Germans wouldn't give us the visa to go through their country. And that's how my family and I got caught up in the Holocaust. Had we been able to immigrate at that time as one family, my life would have gone entirely differently. We got our luggage back, and then the rest of this part, you already know how we had to move from one home to another, etc. So me still don't know about my mother. And then my dad comes home crying from business one day and told me that a lady came into the store and told him that my mother died of so-called natural causes at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Well, the natural causes were probably typhus and starvation. And that's the same camp where Anne Frank died. So there was nothing to wait for. Nobody else was returning from our family. And now our immigration process began all over again. Now I had one little friend, her name happened to have been Agnes also. And she and her parents and her younger sister, all 4 of them survived. I have no idea how. And they were religious Jews, they were Zionists. And as soon as they were able, they immigrated. At that time, there was no state of Israel yet, so they went to Palestine. And of course, from there on, I have no idea what happened to them. So now our immigration process starts all over again. And in January 1947, we went to the railroad station. Julia came and saw us off. She gave me a beautiful little ring as a memento, and she knew she'd never see me again. And my dad and I got on a train and went to Berlin, where we spent a night in a very bombed out hotel, but that was no different than all the buildings in Budapest, because by the end of the war, no building was left unscathed. And next morning, we got up and started our flight across the Atlantic in a propeller Pan Am plane. Well, this was a long trip, and on this trip, my dad had all kinds of opportunities to tell me about this wonderful land we're going to. And whether he truly believed the stories he told, or he was just telling me all that to make his little girl happy, I have no idea. But he told me that we were going to this free land where all the people were rich, and you didn't wash clothes, you just threw it out and bought new. And the streets were paved with milk and honey, and everything was wonderful. And above all, I had 3 cousins in America, and they were all boys. So therefore, I'd be the princess as the only little girl. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that didn't quite work out. But it was very nice to hear at the time. After, well, we encountered a nasty storm over the Atlantic, and we had to make an emergency landing in Newfoundland, where we spent the night. And next day, they showed us into a lovely dining room, white tablecloth, and I have no idea what the food was, but that's the first time I ever saw ice cubes in a glass, and that made such an impression on me that I still think about it today. And then we went on to New York, where my mother's younger sister's husband, who was a CPA, came and met us. And we took a Pullman to Chicago, where I met my new family, my Aunt Betsy, their son Paul, who was a year older than I was, and Tom was 2 years younger than I was. I was totally at a loss. I had studied some English in Hungary, but that was nothing like the spoken English. I understood very little. I was in this strange country with a strange language and strange customs, and I was bewildered. Now, my mother's older sister and her husband, who were both physicians, came over to meet us. And as soon as they heard my dad cough, they shipped him off for a chest x-ray, and he was immediately diagnosed to have had tuberculosis. And those days, tuberculosis was not so readily curable. So off to Winfield Sanitarium he went, which was over an hour's car ride. Every single Sunday, this family took me to see him, and so I could wave to him through the window. Anyhow, here I was and with all these strangers, and they all told me that they loved me, but I didn't believe a word of it. And these are not the people who loved me from the time I was little, and these are total strangers. Everything was different. Because of the language problem, they enrolled me in school. I started in the 3rd grade. I should have been in the 8th grade. By this time, I was 13. And I got promoted as I learned the language. Little kids are very good teachers. They speak a simple language, and they were all delighted to teach me a word or two every day. And as I became better at the language skills, they put me in the 5th grade, the 6th grade, and so on. By the end of the year, I had caught up. I was in the 8th grade. Now at home, nobody talked Hungarian because the kids did not understand Hungarian. So I was truly surrounded by English-speaking people all the time. It was not easy, but it did make me learn the language quite quickly. And Saturday afternoons, I used to go to the movies for a matinee, double feature for 50 cents. And movies are also very good tutorials of the language. So by the time I was ready to graduate grammar school, one semester after I would have had I been born here. And just about at the same time, my daddy was pronounced negative, and my daddy's coming home to me, and I'm absolutely delighted. Now, you asked for the princess. Well, because I was the only girl, I was the one who was asked to wash the dishes, to set the table, and it kept playing over and over in my mind that my daddy said I'd be the princess. And princesses don't do stuff like that. You know, don't misunderstand. Nobody abused me. They didn't ask me to do anything I didn't ask of my own children. But this was a different world. So my daddy's now being discharged, and I'm imagining that he's going to make a home for us and I can get out of this house where I'm so unhappy. And he tells my uncle that he cannot assimilate, he cannot learn the language, and he wants to go back to Hungary. And my uncle, at that time, I was not very happy with him, but I certainly appreciate it now. He said to my dad, if you insist on going back, I'll pay your way, but in no way will I pay for you to take the child back to the country where they murdered our family. And at age 14, my dad and I parted, and that's the last time I had ever seen him. And he went back to Hungary, and I went on to high school here. Those were very, very difficult days. Now, boys and girls, I know that some of you will leave us in a few minutes. So please, it's very important that I give you all a message of please appreciate your democracy and do anything and everything you can to uphold it, because you have no idea how difficult to live under tyranny. Next to food and water, there's nothing more important in your lives than to be free, to have democracy. You're going to graduate high school and turn 18, and it will be up to you which way this country goes. But whoever you wish to vote for, that's your choice, but make sure that you cast your ballot. And when you go home today, please tell somebody that yes, the Holocaust did exist, because although it was on Zoom, you met a Holocaust survivor today. Don't make a judgment on people by their looks. Get to know them. They may look different than you look, but that does not mean that they're not decent, nice people. Get to know them, and then you decide. If you don't like them, you don't have to like everybody, but treat them, everybody, equally, and stand up for the bully, the kid who is being bullied in your class, and become a friend with that child. So I just felt that it was very important that I give you this message before you all have to go. And now I will pick up where I left off. I wish you all well, and thank you for listening to me. So I am going to high school now in the United States, and I am not very happy, to say the least. All I hear from my family is assimilate, assimilate. Don't look for backwards, just go forward. And sometimes it is not so easy just to go forward. Today you have counselors at the school who can help you through some very, very difficult situations. There was nobody to talk to. My family did not want to hear anything about the Holocaust. Nobody wanted to hear anything about the Holocaust. Some Americans we tried to tell our story to, and we got from them, well, we had it hard in America too. We had food rations. Well, food rations are nothing compared to the persecution of Jews in Europe. So they had absolutely no idea, and they didn't want to know. I did well in school, and I overate. My family kept putting me on diets, and nothing worked because I ate when they didn't look. And nobody realized that it was a big hole in my heart for the people I lost. And that's why I'm overeating. And you know, all kids are entitled to the unconditional love of their parents. And that was one of my biggest losses. I did not know if I said no to anything these people asked of me, if they would throw me out on the street or what would happen to me. I had no confidence on being loved by them. And then after a while, I got chubbier and chubbier, and then they started telling me that if you were too fat, nobody is going to love you. Well, that was the last thing I needed to hear, because my self-esteem was in the basement anyhow. Everybody I had loved had deserted me, and that's the way children look at their losses. And it was very, very difficult for me to go on. So my cousins now are getting ready to go to college, and nobody ever considered the fact that I would like to go to college too. My uncle wanted me to take some commercial courses to learn typing and shorthand, which I did not excel in at all because I simply wasn't interested in that. My mom told me I should be a doctor, and that's what I wanted to be. And for that, I had to go to college. So I even went to my school counselor, who told me, well, she gave me some bad advice. She said, just finish high school and worry about that later. I'm a senior in high school. I'm scared to death to even look at a boy. I have no idea how to flirt like the rest of the girls do. I had an idea that if I couldn't become a doctor, I could become a nurse. And I applied to Mount Sinai Hospital's nursing school. And not only did I get admitted, but I got a scholarship. And now I was happier because now I found a way to live away from home and learn something. And then along came a friend of mine and said, Agnes, would you like to go on a blind date? And I said, sure. And that's when I met Danny Kitte. Danny Kitte was 4 years older than I was. He was out of school already at that time. He was a graduate of the Fry Institute, which is a technical school. And at that time, televisions were in their infancy in the US, and they were very different than they're today. They needed servicing constantly, tubes burned out and whatnot. I heard about resistors, etc. Anyhow, there was a boy in this world who liked me. And he kept calling me, and he came over, and he called me some more. And within a very short time, he told me he loved me. My God, there's a boy who loves me. So within 6 weeks, he proposed. I was still in high school. I was not quite 18 years old. And for my 18th birthday, he gave me a little diamond ring. And I went to school and I told my friends that Danny proposed. And my best friend said, and what did you say? And I said, well, I guess I accepted. I think Sylvia was more excited than I was. And with that, news spread through San High School that Agnes is getting married. So I became the belle of the ball. And I enjoyed my popularity. My friends were only going to college, but I was getting married. Wow. Young people in this audience, please don't ever do anything like that. It is most important that you finish your schooling and you have something in your hands that you can make a living with, whether it's a trade or a degree of some sort, but you never know what life will bring upon you and when you'll have to support yourself and your family. I never gave it a second thought at that time. I graduated high school from summer school in July, and in October, we planned a small but very nice wedding. Only the immediate family was invited, and I became Mrs. Daniel Kate. And for the first time since I've come to the United States, I was very, very happy. The marriage brought along 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. My oldest son was born in Houston because after we got married, my husband decided that he didn't like the cold winters here and we should move to Houston. And we did. And I was not familiar with the civil rights movement at all, or slavery. Well, I heard of slavery, but I thought that was all a fairy tale. So I knew very little US history. And it was truly a culture shock to me to see Black washrooms and Black water fountains and white ones. I never imagined that the land of the free would have that. I got pregnant while we were there, and I worked in the store with my husband. Until then, I answered the telephones, etc. So we hired a Black technician after I had the baby, a nice, very clean-cut young man, and we shared a washroom at the business with a family from Southern Illinois, and they actually went to the landlord and complained that they did not want to share a washroom with a Black man. And that was America in the early 1950s. Thank God for the civil rights movement that we would look at things very, very differently today. All men are created equal, and women also. So we moved back to Chicago, and I had 2 more children, and altogether 3, 2 boys and a girl. And I was never happier than to be a wife and a mommy. And I love to have my little kids around me. My husband never made a good living, but we managed, well, mostly with the help of my mother-in-law. And you know, I truly didn't even care about that because I felt that would come somewhere down the line. And after about 13 years of marriage, my husband started to really tell some very, very weird stories. And the first one I remember was that he was teaching trade school in the evenings, and he called me one evening and said, "Don't call me on the phone here because the phones are bugged." I had never doubted a word he had ever said to me. Had I been more mature and grown up, I would have spotted there was something wrong, long time ago. But that was the first downer, and then the stories got wilder and wilder. And finally, my home, well, he called me one day and told me that he was going to commit suicide. And I knew that I needed to get him help. And with the rest of the family, I managed to get him to Michael Reese Hospital, where he was immediately admitted to their psychiatric ward. And the psychiatrist there, a very nice man, said to me, "You're going to need supportive therapy." Contacted Jewish Federation of Chicago and asked them to provide a supportive therapy. That was one of the best advices anybody could have given me. Kids, if you have a problem, don't be too proud to ask for help. There's nothing wrong with asking for help. As a matter of fact, you're a bigger person for us because you're recognizing that you cannot handle some situations alone. So this myth about America and people are ashamed to ask for help is nothing but a myth. So please reach out to your teacher, to your counselor, to your parents, and address the situation, whatever is bothering you. So Danny was in the hospital for 6 weeks, and they pumped him full of medicine. And each visit as we went along got a little better. Finally, after 6 weeks, they were getting ready to release him. And, you know, the doctor wouldn't give me a diagnosis. And I read any and every layman's book I could find on mental illness. And I diagnosed him because he was a classic paranoid schizophrenic. And I told the doctor that, and he couldn't deny it. And he also told me that some paranoid schizophrenics have an acute incident, and some of them, it becomes chronic. So with high hopes, after 6 weeks at the hospital, I took him home. And typical of paranoid schizophrenics, as soon as he got home, he stopped taking his medication. Because for them, the world is out of tune and not them. And I turned to the doctor and I said, well, can I crush it and put it in his coffee? And he said, that's not a good idea because in his state of mind, if he finds it at the bottom of the cup, he's going to feel that you're trying to poison him. So I didn't know that. We went along okay for a little bit. He found a job. He was working for a little while. And then as soon as the medication wore off, he went back and he was readmitted to Michael Reese Hospital several times. And after a while, they told me that they only treat acute patients. And he had definitely become chronic by then. And I had, well, with the help of the Jewish Federation, I had a wonderful therapist who even went to court with me to get him committed to Kankakee State Hospital, which no longer exists. And he bounced in and out of there. And as I went through therapy, my past had unfolded and why I did some of the things I did. And I knew that sooner or later I would have to make a living. There were 3 kids dependent on me, whose lives were also falling apart because our home became so unstable. And they tested me at the Jewish Federation and they wanted to send me to college. And now somebody wants to send me to college. I don't have the time to go to college. I'd love to go, but I have 3 kids. So I went to business college for a year and they paid for that. And that's the only time I've ever taken any charity from anybody, but they paid for my education there and they even gave me a little money for car fare. And I became a very good typist and stenographer and bookkeeper. And I went out in the working world while I was still married to Danny. And we were finally able to put a couple of dollars away with the 2 salaries, and Danny kept quitting jobs. So I could not count on him at all financially. And finally, after 15 years and much therapy, I came to the conclusion that a divorce would be the best for my family. And by that time, I had been working for Wilson and Company, the meat packers and the sporting goods people who at that time had offices downtown Chicago. And I knew I had to make more money. So I started asking around about pay scales. And I found out that law offices had the best pay scales for secretaries. And I looked for a job in the law office. And I found one. And with a very brief interview and with a handshake, Mr. Gore hired me at $10 more a week than I was making. I knew absolutely nothing about the law office, but I learned, and a law office has its own terminology, and I learned so much, and they had the patience to teach me, and I just drank it up. I started to love it. So as luck would have it, sometimes it works. I was with them for 9 years, and the office manager retired, and I got promoted. I got a nice salary increase, and my boss, Mr. Brody, needed somebody to dictate to on Saturdays. So I got paid time and a half for working Saturdays, and I packed up my daughter, my youngest child, and took her with me many a Saturday. And she played and colored while I worked. And that's how we all made it. Nobody ever went hungry. We always had a roof over our heads. And now, at least, I knew I wasn't making much money, but at least the income was steady. So slowly, my children grew up. There was always food on the table. Their friends were always invited for a meal. I could always add a little water to the soup or throw an egg in a frying pan. Nobody was ever turned away from my table. My middle child had some terrific problems when he was a teenager. He was very close to his daddy, and he missed his daddy terribly. And although I tried to, well, I did take my children for therapy, what you don't want to hear, you don't hear. And he was, until his dad died, he was truly under the impression that dad had deserted us. And that certainly wasn't the case. Anyhow, in spite of his problems, he grew up too to be a decent man. And he inherited his dad's ability to fix almost anything. And he started working for one of the hotels, big hotels. And he worked his way up. Now he's with the Hilton Hotel as their chief engineer. He's about ready to retire. And my other two went on to college. Stephen went to University of Illinois downtown, and Cheryl went to Champaign. And when she said she wants to go away to school and she was accepted, I was besides myself because I had no idea how I was going to pay for that. But those days we got grants and scholarships. And by that time, Danny was sick enough that Social Security started sending me some small payments for the children. So that was her spending money in college. And to that, well, they're all grown up today. As a matter of fact, my oldest son is retired. He ended up in the printing business. He was a born businessman from the time he was little. When he was old enough, he delivered newspapers, and for a while he delivered the morning paper and the afternoon paper. And I said, Stephen, that's too much. And he said, after I get my Christmas tips, I will give up. And my middle child is still working, and my daughter is near retirement age, and she's part-time employed. She is married, so she doesn't have to work. And 3 kids gave me 4 super duper grandchildren. Unfortunately, my family is scattered all over the United States, but I thrive through my grandchildren. I live through their lives because my grandchildren all have secondary degrees. They're all living the life I would have liked for myself. And today I have 2 great-grandchildren in Florida, one from one grandchild, and 2 older ones in Colorado. And I recently heard that my baby granddaughter, who is now in her mid-30s, and she's a physical therapist, so is her husband, is expecting a baby in August. So I hope to have another baby in my arms. And I am extremely proud of my family. They mean everything to me. I'm very close to my family. I talk to somebody, one of the kids or the grandchildren, just about on a daily basis. Up until COVID came along, I used to spend about 3 weeks in Florida every winter. Well, and after the children grew up, well, I dated some while I was single during the 15 years they grew up, but I never met anybody I would have even considered marrying. And besides that, nobody's breaking down the door to marry a woman with 3 children, let's be honest. So the kids were all grown now when a friend of mine called and said, I know a recently divorced man, would you like to meet him? And by that time, I was truly quite complacent living alone. But I met Henry, and once again, my life did a turn. And after dating him for a year, we got married. And that marriage had also some problems because he had a mentally ill son. Somehow, mental illness followed me all my life. But that's another discussion because I could talk a great deal about how mentally ill people are not understood and not taken care of the way they should be, and nobody seems to care about their families. So my dad, after he returned to Europe, eventually remarried. He married a lady who lost her husband in the war. I never met her. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The girl just happened to have been my age, so you can imagine as a teenager how terrible I felt that now my daddy's hugging another little girl. My relationship with him truly fell apart, not because of him, but because of me. I resented him leaving me alone to this day. I have my moments when I don't understand how he could have done that. And I have other days when I feel more forgiving, and I realize that the war did some terrible things to him also. And well, what else can I tell you? My dad died quite young. He erected a beautiful monument after he returned to Hungary. I have a photograph of it, my mom's family who had perished, and was in one of the cemeteries, and all their names were engraved. And one of my cousins went to Hungary maybe 10 years ago, and went to look at that gravesite, and the cemetery keeper showed them where it was, and it had been desecrated and destroyed. And ladies and gentlemen, Hungary is a very, very anti-Semitic country, even to this day. I recently read an article how much worse it's getting there again. And I don't know what to do about Hungary, but I certainly value, most of the value besides my children, my American citizenship and the freedom I found. You know, some people came to America to find gold. I found freedom, and I'm perfectly happy with that. My second husband and I were married for 20 years when he passed away. And I was on my last law office job for 17 years. When we first got married, we talked about that I would work for 5 years, but I loved my job. And finally, we were able to save some money, which came in very handy after I retired. And He was a diabetic, so I retired a few months earlier would I have otherwise, but he needed care and he got sicker and sicker. He ended up having open heart surgery and then on dialysis, and the last couple of years of his life were very, very difficult. So I think that I could open the floor for some questions at this point, and I'd be delighted to answer. And
Thank you so much, Agnes. You have given us so much to think about. I call them the Agnes zingers that you throw in there, those things for us to think about, not only about the trauma that you experienced in the war and here, the issues with mental health and counseling, and
that's very
how
important to me.
it's very important. It should be very important to all of us.
Yes.
So since we have several schools on the call, if you have some questions, if you would put them in the chat, I will ask Agnes. I know we're almost at the end of our time here together. And Agnes has been speaking for us all week. And so we are so grateful that again and again, you are willing to tell your story so that people understand the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, and how happy endings are very complicated and long time coming sometimes.
You know, people also have to understand that you don't have to be in a concentration camp for to have ruined your life. Because my life certainly would have gone very differently if I had my mother and father throughout.
Very differently. One question, Agnes, and this may be the only one we have time for today, is Julia. Do you know what happened
Yes.
to Julia, and did you ever see her again?
My dad wrote me when Julia passed away. In my mind, Julia was older than my parents. I'm really not sure of that. But anyhow, Julia got sick, and Julia and I kept in contact. And then she passed away, and I was an adult by this time. And I started corresponding with Yad Vashem in Israel, in Jerusalem, and I wanted her noted in the Avenue of the Righteous Christians. This was very important to me. And after a couple of years of correspondence, they finally accepted her. And they wanted to send her family a plaque or papers. And I said, as far as I know, she has no family. I'd be very happy to receive them, but they wouldn't send that to me. They did send me a certificate showing that she was accepted. And I was in Israel about 13 years ago. And first of all, Yad Vashem took my testimony, which exists there and here with the Illinois Holocaust Museum. But also, I was very overcome when I was there because I felt like I was at Julia's grave. And perhaps as a child, I didn't truly understand how she risked her life to save mine. And by this time, I knew that I wouldn't be here talking to you today if it wasn't for Julia.
You know, this is one of the things that IHE, we talk about all the time, about the moral courage that is so rare. Yes. You know, when we talk about people who helped the Jews during the Holocaust, that was about 1% of the European population. And so it was a very rare, but very valuable thing.
Well, you have to remember that if you had a family, you were jeopardizing the life of your family if you dared to hide a Jew. Yeah. And a child asked me not too long ago, would I have hidden a Jew? And I very quickly would have liked to say, by all means, but then I thought about it. And would I have, had I had children or parents or sisters and brothers to worry about? I don't know. It's an instantaneous decision that you have to make at that time. You just cannot figure it out ahead of time.
But sometimes I think it helps if we do think about it ahead of time, because I think we would all like to think we would have been the Meep Geeses of this world, you know, the people who would have hidden Anne Frank, who would have helped you but that is a really good question. Would we? And I think if we think about some of these things before we have to make these hard moral decisions, that maybe we will be better equipped to make them in the end. I have one more question from Gretna, and then I know we have to sign off.
I hope that you never have to make this decision.
I hope we never have to make those decisions too. The question is, do you think the raw experience the Jewish survivors in the Holocaust had made them stronger people after the war?
Oh, there's no question about that. I am certainly stronger than I was beforehand. Of course, I was a child and I had to grow up. But, you know, the hard times I've had, and I'll tell you, I got a lot of education working in law offices, and I just drank it up. Please, your education is very, very important. That's the one thing that's a regret in my life, that I never had a chance to go to college.
Wow, you could not leave it at a better point for all these
Oh.
young people. Gretna, I'm so glad you guys got to hang on until the end. And you, all schools today will be getting a copy of Agnes's book for your library. I will get those in the mail as soon as this week is over. Agnes, thank you so much for being with us on your 10th annual Week of Understanding. Gretna, thank you again, and welcome to Wahoo and North Bend and Humboldt. We hope you get involved next year as well. And with that, we will sign off today.
I love you all.
We love you, Agnes.
We
Thank
love you, Agnes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Farewell.
You're
Oh, I love
welcome.
that. Yes, thank you.